keeping it brief, I will now hand over to Tony to pay tribute, I think that's the right word, to Richard Dove.
Thank you, Monica. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce the book Working for the War Effort, German-Speaking Refugees in British Propaganda During the Second World War by Charmian Brinson and Richard Dove. Now, Charmian Brinson and Richard Dove are among the most highly regarded experts working in the field of the refugees from Nazi Germany who fled to Britain after 1933. Professor Brinson's many publications include a study of the mysterious deaths of Dora Fabian and Mathilde Wurm, two refugee social democrats in London in 1935, numerous path-breaking articles on women refugees, especially those who were interned by the British government in summer 1940, and the very popular Fleeing from the Führer, a postal history of the refugees from the Nazis, written with William Kaczynski. Professor Dove's publications include a biography of the playwright and political activist Ernst Toller, a study of 5 German-speaking literary exiles in Britain called Journey of No Return, and the fetchingly titled Foreign Parts, German and Austrian Actors on the British Stage, 1933 to 60. One of Professor Brinson's and Professor Dove's greatest contributions lies in the highly original studies that they've produced together on the previously neglected subjects of the Free German League of Culture in Britain during the war. The book is Politics by Other Means, and the surveillance of anti-Nazi refugees by MI5. The book is called A Matter of Intelligence, which MI5 didn't, in their opinion, show that much. I'm sure they're right. Now, in Working for the War Effort, Brinson and Dove have taken on the contribution that the mostly Jewish refugees from Nazism made to British propaganda during the war. As in their previous studies, there's a considerable emphasis on refugees who were active in the cultural and artistic fields, and a certain fondness for left-wingers, like the composer and musicologist Ernst Hermann Meyer, the very model of a loyal Communist Party liner, and the Soviet spy Peter Smolka, Smollett. The book is impeccably researched, drawing extensively on the files of a range of government departments, on the BBC Written Archive Centre at Caversham, and on sources relevant to the individual refugees discussed. The book is divided into 2 parts, propaganda on the home front and propaganda to the enemy, reflecting the differences between the production of overt and covert or black propaganda. The first part of the book concentrates largely on the Ministry of Information, housed in the University of London's imposing Senate House building in Bloomsbury, and responsible for propaganda to the home front and to neutral countries, using films, the visual arts, as well as broadcasting and a German language newspaper. When it came to broadcasting to a German audience, the refugees from Nazi Germany were invaluable to the British, given their native command of German and their familiarity with conditions in Germany or Austria, though some British officials remained reluctant to employ them, whether out of a residual hostility to Germans or to Jews is often unclear, probably both. The book's second part brings to life the highly effective campaign of black propaganda waged most notably by the journalist Dennis Sefton-Delmer, who'd been head of the Berlin bureau of the Daily Express and had known Hitler personally. The most important means of transmitting propaganda to Germany was, of course, the BBC, whose German language broadcasting, begun at the time of the Munich crisis in autumn 1938, became the BBC German service under Hugh Carlton-Green, later probably the greatest Director General of the BBC since the war. Clandestine, black broadcasting was conducted under Sefton-Delmer from around the Duke of Bedford's estate at Woburn Abbey. Delma launched, for example, the Kurzwellensender Atlantic, shortwave station Atlantic, and its successor, Soldatensender Calais, Soldiers Station Calais, which both posed as German radio stations in order to broadcast material that assisted the Allied war effort by undermining German morale. I would say in conclusion that working for the war effort is a pioneering piece of research that opens up a previously unremarked area to readers both academic and lay. Clearly written and structured, its findings will be of great value to those who take an interest in British wartime propaganda. At some future stage, a popular historian will likely use the book's material to write a bestseller a la Ben Macintyre, trumpeting the discovery of a new and secret dimension to the Allied victory over Nazi Germany. That would be a tribute to the originality and quality of Brinson and Dove's research. I'd just like to add on a personal note that I, as chair of the Research Centre, and all the colleagues at the Research Centre send our very, very best wishes to Richard Dove and wish him very well. Thank you very much, Monica.
Lovely, thank you, Tony. Indeed, I should add that this, I think I'm right in saying, Charmian, is the first launch event for this wonderful book. Am I right? So we're very
yes, it is.
We're very honoured that you agreed to talk on this occasion. Lovely. Well, I have to say, Tony's rather taken the wind out of my sails, because I was going to regale you with some of those details of Charmian's numerous publications. I should perhaps just add for the record that she's emeritus or emerita, perhaps professor at Imperial College, London, and she's acted as I use the word nurturer, I think that's really the right sort of word, the encourager and nurturer of many a younger scholars, researchers in this rich cultural terrain. I will perhaps also just add, before I hand over to Charmian, that we could easily have roped her in, and indeed we were very tempted to rope her into some of the events that in the series that preceded this one, namely on the whole morally murky internment of enemy aliens episode, because she has written, well, she wrote the introduction, for example, to Ruth Borchard's account of her own or semi-autobiographical account of her internment experience. She's written also on Fred Ullman's internment images, somebody we haven't actually dwelt on, but also a really important figure in all this. And indeed, she's also well, I mean, many other things. I will stop there, but she really is very much the elder stateswoman in this area, and we're delighted to have you tonight, Charmian. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Monica, and thank you, Tony, as well, for your kind introduction. And my best wishes to Richard Dove, who I hope will be listening in. So first, a word or two about the genesis of this book. In 2014, as Tony already said, Richard and I published a book, an earlier book, entitled A Matter of Intelligence, which looked at a hitherto unresearched area of Anglo-German relations in the 30s and 40s, the dealings between MI5 and the German-speaking refugees from Nazism. MI5's attitude towards the refugees, so we discovered, was one largely of suspicion, which, although sometimes justified, was frequently without any justification at all. Richard's and my most recent book, Working for the War Effort, German-speaking refugees in British propaganda during the Second World War, that I'm talking about today, also looks at a barely researched area of Anglo-German wartime relations, but from a quite different perspective. British suspicions, while by no means absent, were certainly not the dominant sentiment here in British dealings with refugees. But this is a study of German and Austrian refugees' participation in the British war effort, that is, in a particular aspect of it, British wartime propaganda. It's true that refugee participation in other aspects of the war effort, in the Pioneer Corps, or later the British forces, for example, just think of the work of Helen Fry, has been relatively well documented. And indeed, from around 1941, able-bodied men and women, including refugees, were first encouraged and then required to register for war work. But what has scarcely been examined up until now is refugee participation in propaganda, both overt and covert. The scope of the contribution made by so-called enemy aliens has never been properly acknowledged in the usually triumphalist British accounts of World War II. So, in the Second World War, Britain produced official propaganda which infiltrated every aspect of people's lives. In its propaganda to the home front, it encouraged the British, as well as the resident refugee population, to support the war effort by praising their courage and resilience, and it fostered hatred towards the enemy, whom it portrayed as cruel and aggressive. Nor was British propaganda confined to the home front. Appropriate publicity was directed abroad to neutral countries like Portugal and South America, and to Allied countries such as France, at least until 1940, and the Soviet Union from 1941, which set out to promote understanding for and support of the British cause. And at the same time, Britain produced propaganda to the enemy, that is, to the refugees' own compatriots, using the language of the enemy in which to deliver it. Now, it's interesting to consider why the British authorities wanted or needed the assistance of the German and Austrian refugees. Up to 80,000, the figures disputed, but let's take that figure anyway, about 80,000 of whom had arrived in Britain by the outbreak of war in their propaganda output. In fact, even before the war, a discussion had taken place as to how the refugee community could be made use of in anti-Nazi propaganda. In September 1938, for example, the journalist and broadcaster Vernon Bartlett wrote to Rex Leeper, who was a diplomat at the Foreign Office, with particular reference to broadcasting that, I quote, "There are now in London so many German-speaking publicists of standing that a first-class advisory committee could and should at once be formed." He suggested as especially good candidates for such a committee the journalist and diplomat Jonas von Ustinov, who is in fact the father of Peter Ustinov, and the broadcaster and publicist Edgar Stern-Rubart. Bartlett also discussed the possibility of setting up a volunteer corps of, slide please, German refugees. Monica, can I have a slide please? Sorry, wait a minute while you catch up. That's it. German refugees who should tell the German people why they themselves, honest and patriotic Germans, are thinking of taking action against their native country. After the outbreak of war, the authorities began to recognize more fully the potential value of German refugees to the war effort. Their most important role was to be in producing and delivering propaganda to the enemy. That is, to their compatriots inside the German Reich and elsewhere, where their native command of German and their first-hand knowledge of German and Austrian society soon proved indispensable. German language propaganda, both written and broadcast, was targeted at German and Austrian civilians inside the Reich, as well as those in the German Army and Navy, and in the occupied countries, but also in the German-speaking refugee populations in Britain and elsewhere, for example, in South America. And it's also useful to consider why German and Austrian refugees would have wished to participate in the British war effort. Most of them, both Jews, perhaps 90% of the refugee population, and non-Jews, were motivated by their strong opposition to Nazism, strengthened by the experience of persecution that many of them had suffered prior to their emigration. Among them were numerous political refugees who'd fled into exile because of their membership of anti-Nazi political parties, such as the Social Democrats or the Communists, and they continued to belong to their oppositional political groups in emigration. Another factor was undoubtedly a sense of self-preservation. Many of the exiles' names had been well known to the German public and were certainly known to the Gestapo. Refugees particularly feared a Nazi invasion of Britain, acknowledging that few of them would survive a Nazi occupation here. Those looking further ahead also recognized that only a British or an Allied victory would ensure that they could return to Germany or Austria, where at that time, many still had friends or family. Could I have a slide, please, Monica? The Ministry of Information, set up on the outbreak of war in 1939, was one of the most important institutions producing British wartime propaganda that made use of the talents available in the German-speaking refugee population. Though not openly conceded, it's probable that the example of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda in Berlin played a significant role in the establishment of the new ministry. However, the term propaganda, suggesting disinformation, would not have been acceptable in the British context. In any case, the Ministry of Information, unlike its German counterpart, strove wherever possible to present the truth, even if exaggerated or by no means the whole truth, that is to say, white propaganda. There were, of course, other covert British organisations specialising in subversive black propaganda that sought to sabotage the Nazis' war effort. That is Electra House, the Special Operations Executive, or SOE, and the Political Warfare Executive, PWE. These organisations, like the Ministry of Information, involve very many German-speaking refugees in their work. The Ministry of Information was based in the then newly built and imposing Senate House building of the University of London. The author Graham Greene, who worked in the Ministry of Information's publication division for a time, memorably described it as, a new slide please, the high, heartless building with complicated lifts and long passages, like those of a liner and lavatories where the water never ran hot and the nail brushes were chained like Bibles. Central heating gave it the stuffy smell of mid-Atlantic, except in the passages, where the windows were always open for fear of blasts and the cold wind whistled in. From its Senate House headquarters, the Ministry of Information produced a plethora of propaganda materials in the form of print, radio programs and films, as well as visual materials such as posters and exhibitions. Lecturers were sent around the country, addressing audiences in venues ranging from factories to town halls. With ever-increasing numbers of staff, at its peak there were around 4,500 staff in Britain and also abroad. The ministry also played a role in the production of publicity material by other government departments and indeed private firms. Dozens of German refugees were drafted in on a more or less ad hoc basis, usually as part-time consultants, despite the official wartime status of most of them as enemy aliens. The reason for the consultancy system was the ruling that only British citizens could be appointed to full-time positions in the British civil service, including the Ministry of Information, of course. However, a few refugees did manage it. Both the German Orientalist and political scientist Ernst Jaeckh, slide please, Monica, and the multilingual Austrian journalist Peter Smolka, anglicised to Smollett, both of them had been in Britain for more than the requisite 5 years and had taken British nationality before the war. Both Jaeckh and Smolka were appointed to the Foreign Publicity Department, with Jaeckh having responsibility for the Middle East section and, in addition, for contacts between the Ministry of Information and the refugee population at large, a number of whom were writing in to offer their services. Smolka, alias Smollett, who was initially in charge of British publicity to neutral countries like Portugal and Switzerland, enjoyed a stellar career in the ministry. After the Soviet Union entered the war in June 1941, Smolka was put in charge of the newly founded Anglo-Soviet liaison section, a role in which he proved extraordinarily successful. He was also, it later turned out, a Soviet agent, but that is another story. Very few refugees obtained British nationality in wartime and hence permanent status at the Ministry of Information. But one who did in wartime was the German writer and journalist Peter de Mendelssohn, slide please, who'd taken over responsibility for British news to neutral countries after Smolka's promotion. Newly released documents reveal that the fact that Mendelssohn was not British had proved a considerable handicap in top-level meetings, for instance with ambassadors. And it also showed that the Ministry of Information had claimed on his behalf that, I quote, exceptional steps were required in the national interest. But refugees like Jaeckh, Smolka and de Mendelssohn were scarcely representative of the many refugees who work for the Ministry of Information and British propaganda on a less formal level, as writers and journalists, designers, artists, scientists, statisticians, actors, musicians, filmmakers and broadcasters, some of whom I'd like to say a little bit more about. One rather curious phenomenon in wartime Britain was the publication of a German language newspaper, written by refugees for refugees, but controlled and financed by the Ministry of Information, although the ministry's role in this was not known. The aim, as set out by two of the paper's founding journalists, the German refugees Sebastian Haffner, slide please, and Hans Lothar, included to shape and form the unpolitical or disunited German-speaking population and, I quote, to assist any effort which will contribute to the early success of the English war effort. It was thought that as well as proving an effective propaganda instrument towards the refugees in Britain, the paper could also be useful for British publicity purposes in South America, as well as for the RAF to drop over the Reich in a lightweight airmail version. The editorial team of refugee journalists were all, like Haffner and Lothar, highly experienced newspapermen. For instance, Julius Reichenheim, who'd worked on the Swiss Neue Zeitung, and Hans Uhlich, who wrote under the pseudonym Peter Konrad, who had been the economics editor of the former German establishment paper, the Frankfurter Zeitung. The diplomatic correspondent was Peter de Mendelssohn, who we already just encountered in the administrative post at the ministry. To maximize the paper's propaganda impact, particularly in Germany, the British authorities had warned against there being too many Jewish journalists among the editorial contingent. But in the event, the team included a sizable Jewish presence, not least Peter de Mendelssohn, who bore one of the great names of German Jewry. Because Die Zeitung was aimed at several different readerships at once, it put out a rather curious mixture of anti-Nazi and pro-British propaganda, which did not always sit very easily together. The anti-Nazi material, which was aimed at German speakers in neutral countries, German prisoners of war, and Germans inside the Reich, tended to concentrate either on German reverses in the war or the increasingly bad situation inside the Reich. The pro-British propaganda, on the other hand, which was directed at the German-speaking refugees in Britain, consisted of informative, though highly idealized accounts of British history, customs, and institutions. The aim was to strengthen the reader's identification with Britain and the British cause, and most importantly, to encourage them to participate in the British war effort. One example from March 1943 that must have strained credulity to the utmost: a 95-year-old woman who was thrown clean out of her bed by a bomb was determined not to be upset by the incident, but rather continued immediately with her work of making articles for the Aid to Russia Fund. Another, earlier example from July 1941 claimed, though not without some humor, that British dogs were politer and less aggressive than continental dogs. Proof of this was provided by the dog that had previously belonged to the German ex-ambassador to Britain, Joachim von Ribbentrop. This dog, a Chow, had been, I quote, arrogant and irritable when in Ribbentrop's care, but having remained behind in England was now a reformed character. Die Zeitung was only one of many propaganda areas overseen by the Ministry of Information involving the written and or the spoken word. The ministry promoted suitable literature for domestic and overseas propaganda. For instance, the anti-Nazi book Hitler Speaks by the German conservative ex-politician Hermann Rauschning. Extant documents show that the Ministry of Information was negotiating with British publishers on Rauschning's behalf, and indeed the book became a bestseller. Other books by refugees favored by the Ministry of Information included Tomorrow's War by the Austrian economist Stefan Lorant and the Swiss-Austrian Eugene Lenhoff's 1001 Nazi Lies. Another bestseller in Britain was Irmgard Litten. A slide here, please. Her book called A Mother Fights Hitler, which the ministry also promoted as a North American edition and a Spanish language edition. Irmgard Litten's books describe the intense efforts she had made over 5 years to free her eldest son, the anti-Nazi lawyer Hans Litten, from a Nazi prison, an endeavor in which she ultimately proved unsuccessful. Irmgard Litten who was initially very involved in exile in broadcasting for the BBC, was also engaged by the Ministry of Information in 1941 to take part in its large-scale program of talks throughout Britain. According to her own account, quote, she delivered more than 1,000 lectures on Nazism all over the country. And clearly a great deal was expected of her. During 1 week in Yorkshire, for example, in November 1942, her schedule was as follows. A slide, please. Huddersfield Rotary Club, Barnsley Rotary Club, Cleckheaton Public Library, Wakefield Public Library, Bradford Rotary Club, Hull Business Women's Luncheon Club. A tour of Scotland the month before had involved her in speaking 8 times, while one in North Wales had required her to lecture at 9 different locations. The success of her book must have been a significant factor in attracting audiences, for as she recalled, a slide please, I often was sent to districts where it was very difficult to get people to attend lectures at all. But always I was able to report the hall was packed. Why? Undoubtedly because the theme of just ordinary daily life in Germany was an attraction to them. However, as already exemplified by Die Zeitung, Ministry of Information sponsored propaganda was made up both of anti-Nazi and of pro-British elements. A powerful example of the latter, that is the pro-British elements, is provided by a series of books launched in 1941 entitled Britain in Pictures. With support from the ministry, a book packaging company, Adprint, run by 2 Austrian refugees, Walter Neurath, slide please, and Wolfgang Foges, produced a total of 126 beautifully illustrated little books with titles such as The English Poets and the Government of Britain. I should thank Anna Neuberg at this point for having introduced me to these books. It's interesting to note that as with Die Zeitung, the Ministry of Information did not advertise its involvement in its numerous book projects, assuming, probably quite correctly, that official endorsement would have an adverse effect on customer sales. As it was, the Britain in Pictures books sold extremely well, both at home and abroad, though their intended readership was primarily located overseas in the United States, South America, and the British Empire. First and foremost, the books were intended as propaganda for Britain and the British cause, as is clear from the dust jacket for the first few volumes. Could I have a slide, please? The English have never been good at describing themselves or their ways, either for their own benefit or for the benefit of others. It is therefore not surprising that no comprehensive series of books at a popular price, illustrating in print and picture the life, art, institutions, and achievements of the British people has ever been issued, either for British or for foreign readers. At this time, when it has become essential for citizens throughout the empire to take stock of themselves and their ideas and to express them to others, it is desirable to fill this gap. It is hoped that British in Pictures will contribute to a better understanding of Great Britain and the British Commonwealth. Of the 2 Austrians, we've had Walter Neurath, now Wolfgang Foges, could I have a slide, please? Not a good quality one, I must apologize. Served as managing director of Adprint, while Walter Neurath was responsible for the design of the books. It's evident that both men were considered extremely valuable for the war effort. Foges, for his part, was not interned at all, unlike most male enemy aliens in 1940-41. And most unusually, he was naturalized in 1943, while Neurath was released from internment in August 1940, that is, after an exceptionally short period. There's a newly released Home Office file, which considers the case for Foges' early naturalization, alongside the still earlier one of Peter de Mendelssohn, that I spoke of earlier, and this reveals the strict precondition then in force. The granting of naturalizations had to be, I quote, of material help to the war effort. In Foges' case, the Ministry of Information supported his naturalization application on the grounds that, I quote, he is engaged in planning and publishing books which are designed as propaganda for Great Britain and of which propaganda use is made by the Ministry of Information in many directions. However, the ministry was not always so successful in its support of its protégés, as the case of the Hungarian refugee, Stefan Lorant, slide please, serves to show. Lorant, an extraordinarily accomplished journalist and photographer in British exile, into which he had fled after imprisonment in a Nazi concentration camp, founded the celebrated picture magazine Picture Post in London in 1938. A convinced anti-Nazi, Lorant repeatedly put his magazine at the ministry's disposal for propaganda purposes. For example, was a special American number in June 1940, an issue entitled What We Are Fighting For in July 1940. A third, at the Ministry of Information's request in June 1940, included 27 pages entitled Against Invasion, which among other things contained rather alarming instructions on how to dismantle a tank. Nothing represents a desperate downturn in the British war effort, the British war situation by mid-1940 more clearly than this. Hampered in the carrying out of his job by Home Office regulations for aliens, and convinced that he would figure on the Nazi blacklist in the event of an invasion, Lorant applied to the Home Office for British naturalization. He was supported in this by the Ministry of Information, who pleaded that if Lorant were unable to continue in the editorship of Picture Post, I quote, "It would be much against our interest, as Picture Post is anxious to do a great deal of our propaganda for us." There was, however, a snag. The Home Office reported back that their dossier on Lorant was, I quote, "not a good one," and that they were, I quote again, "not in the least enthusiastic about his naturalization." As a result, Lorant left Britain for the United States, though his was a contribution that Britain could ill afford to lose. Now, so far, this talk has concentrated on the Ministry of Information and the refugees' role in its propaganda through the written and spoken word, though in fact this barely scratches the surface of its wide-ranging propaganda activities. Film production, for example, through the Ministry's Crown Film Unit, made use of the German composer Hermann Meyer, we have a slide please, for composing its musical scores, the Austrian author Robert Neumann to devise film scenarios, and the German actress Lucie Mannheim, a slide please, who in the final sequence of the film, The True Story of Lili Marlene, sang the song that had proved so popular with both the German and British armies. Intended as propaganda on the home front, Mannheim produced a parody version of Lili Marlene using English lyrics as follows. I won't sing them. Führer, I thank and greet you, for you and good and wise. Widows and orphans meet you with hollow and silent eyes. Hitler, the man of blood and fear, hang him up from the lantern here. Hang him up from the lantern here of your Lili Marlene. In addition to the work of its own Crown Film Unit, the Ministry of Information also sought to influence feature film production in wartime Britain, first by approving themes and content, and then by offering filmmakers tangible inducements, including the supply of scarce film stock, access to otherwise unobtainable government facilities, and facilitating the release of artists from military service. 1941 saw the beginning of a spate of war films that were strongly supportive of the war effort and frequently featured foreign accent roles, that is, Nazis, Prussian officers, resistance fighters, and so on. Consequently, refugee actors such as Anton Walbrook, Albert Leven, Frederick Walk, Karl-Heinz Jaffe, and Martin Miller, I'd like a slide please, who first made his name in Britain through his astonishingly convincing impersonation of Adolf Hitler, were able to benefit professionally while at the same time making their own contribution to the British war effort. The refugee artists constitute another group who made a significant contribution to British anti-Nazi propaganda and the war effort, in particular, the political cartoonists and the poster artists. I'll concentrate here for a couple of minutes on the poster artists who produce work for the home front and for overseas, either directly for the Ministry of Information or under the aegis of the Ministry for other official bodies. The refugee graphic artists included the two Germans, FHK Henrion and Hans Schläger, and the Polish-born George Him, and we have a slide of him, and Jan Lewitt, who together made up the partnership Lewitt-Him. Each of them brought modernist principles to still rather traditionally inclined Britain from continental institutions strongly influenced by the Bauhaus. This proved professionally advantageous to the artists themselves, and a second advantage arose from the fact that poster design was deemed to be of the greatest importance for wartime British propaganda. Some of the wartime posters that are best remembered today, instructing and exhorting the British public to try harder, save more, take greater care, help the war effort, were the work of these artists, among others, of course. And they bore titles such as Grow Your Own Food, we have a picture of that, Dig for Victory, Join the ATS, Go by Shank's Pony, or In the Blackout. The Ministry of Food commissioned Lewitt-Him in 1943 to decorate the walls of the ubiquitous government-run British restaurants. And the Polish pair came up with the vegetable, we have a picture of that, thank you, an amiable-looking bull composed entirely of vegetables to emphasize their food value. So popular did this image turn out to be, the poster went through several reprints. As for exhibitions, one of the most memorable in which Henrion, for one, was involved, was not commissioned by the Ministry of Education or other official body, but rather by the Left of Centre Artists International Association. For their 1943 exhibition for Liberty, Henrion designed the exhibition exterior with a poster composed of 4 doves representing freedom of speech and of religion, freedom from fear and from want, and with an exhibition logo echoing the dove motif. This group of refugees, the graphic designers, was arguably the one that made the greatest impact in British exile, both in wartime propaganda and after the war, when they participated in the 1951 Festival of Britain, receiving public acclaim for their work. It could be said that they disproved the initial contention in our book, that the role of refugees in British wartime propaganda has never been properly recognised. In fact, it would probably be more accurate to claim that it was above all the refugees taking part in black propaganda whose contribution has remained unrecognised, as will now be considered. And I'd like to start with the curious case of Fritz Demuth, so described because while his wartime trajectory started off in the white domain of the Ministry of Information, it later took him into more covert territory. Fritz Demuth had been a very high-ranking civil servant and economist in Weimar, Germany. Arriving in British exile in 1936, he became the London-based director of the Emergency Committee for German Scholars in Exile, whose aim was to place German university teachers and researchers in academic positions in one of the countries of emigration. By the outbreak of war, in fact, around 600 scholars had been so placed, both in Britain and around the world. Just before the war, Demuth had already written to the Ministry of Information's Foreign Publicity Department, offering them his organization's services as follows. I quote, "These people placed by us could be useful for propaganda purposes. We could, through them, reach many countries and all manner of important persons in official and private positions." As for the scholars who Demuth had placed within Britain, they could, for example, I quote again, "form a nucleus of a body of experts in economic, financial, and propaganda material in connection with Central and Eastern Europe." Demuth's chief point of contact with the ministry was Ernst Jaeckh. One of his responsibilities was liaison between the ministry and the refugee population. But it's interesting to note that Demuth's introductory letter to Jaeckh was also seen by Ian Colvin at Electra House, which was a secret department of the Foreign Office producing propaganda to the enemy, and it was positively received. Colvin wrote at Electra House, I quote, "Although we are chary of assuming relations with German refugees, it was his belief that Demuth's offer should be taken seriously. The committee could be used to spread British views and attitudes abroad which might counter the predicted, quoting again, violent campaigns of hatred against us conducted by Germans scattered all over the world. By mid-September 1939, a meeting had already been held between Demuth, Jaeckh and Colvin, that's Jaeckh in the Ministry of Information and Colvin in Electra House, to discuss ways in which Demuth's emergency committee could help British propaganda work. These were to include the establishment of refugee advisory committees on propaganda and broadcasting, and the 3 groups of economists with different specialisms. Within a fortnight, moreover, Demuth had compiled a list of around 60 names, including some of the best-known names of the German emigration in Britain, such as the former German Minister of Transport, Gottfried Treviranus, or the banker Siegmund Warburg. It's clear from this that Demuth was now looking well beyond the scholars registered with the Emergency Committee and was including in his planning leading members of the wider German emigration to make up what he termed as an anti-Nazi union for freedom and justice. In fact, that name gets dropped fairly early on, and the refugees around Demuth were later generally known as the Demuth Circle or the Demuth Committee. An important factor here was that despite surprisingly little being known about him and his activities today, Demuth was arguably one of the best connected and most influential refugees in Britain at that time. Reporting back to Jaeckh in the Ministry of Information, the Demuth Committee set about working on the production of articles and pamphlets, including a lengthy bulletin on the war designed for, quote, democratically minded Germans, especially in South America. So useful did the Demuth Committee turn out to be that by the following year, 1940, interest was going beyond the Ministry of Information in their possible use. One of their interested parties was the Ministry for Economic Warfare, whose primary purpose was to hamper the German war effort by preventing vital commodities from reaching German industry. Details of the sort of black propaganda and sabotage work undertaken by the Demuth Committee are directly and indirectly revealed in the Special Operations Executive File, the SOE that being an offshoot of the Ministry for Economic Warfare. And this file opens with a letter from an exiled barrister, Wilhelm Weinberg. Weinberg had written in to suggest an ingenious scheme for propaganda, whereby a considerable number of anonymous letters be posted in Germany should be sent to German officers purporting to come from a German with a military background and containing criticism of the Nazi war operation. It transpired, so the SOE file reports, that the Demuth Committee was working on an almost exactly identical scheme, one evidently to consist of what was called a rumor campaign to be spread by bogus letters in enemy countries. Another such scheme from spring 1941 that aimed to undermine a Nazi-Soviet agreement involving deliveries of oil and other goods from Russia in exchange for machinery from Germany. And this is elaborated on in greater detail. Fake letters have been sent out from Demuth and his committee to members of the Reichsgruppe Elektroindustrie, that's the leading members of the German electrical industry, advising them there was no longer any need to expedite machinery deliveries to the Soviet Union. As a result, when the German-Russian Economic Commission had met in Berlin, the Russians had announced that since German deliveries of machinery had proved inadequate, they would now have to restrict their counter deliveries of oil to the Reich. The Demuth Committee continued with their work, which also included the compilation of an archive of some 800,000 cuttings on Germany and its allies, until well past the end of the war. And there were numerous other refugees involved in different forms of black propaganda, such as in clandestine broadcasting to the enemy, which was conducted in and around Woburn Abbey on the estate of the Duke of Bedford, a location conveniently close to London, but scarcely disturbed by the war. The broadcasting team, most of whom were enemy aliens, were led by the journalist Stefan Lorant, a British citizen with the native command of German, who was recruited to the SOE in September 1940. Delmer's activities bore little or no relation to the white broadcasting to the enemy being conducted at that same time by the BBC. whose German and Austrian services, also employers of large numbers of refugees, always declared its identity and strove wherever possible to tell the truth. Over time, Delmer set up a number of bogus radio stations, the first of these being known as Gustav Siegfried I or GS1. The station, purportedly based in Germany or German-occupied Europe, though in fact situated in Bedfordshire, would expose the corruption of Nazi officials and officers through the commentary of an upright and ardently nationalistic German officer. This represented a new departure in British official broadcasting, transmitting news which was a calculated balance of fact and fiction and was designed to mislead and disorientate the German listener. As Delmer himself said, the objective of GSI is subversive. It will spread disturbing and disruptive news to induce the Germans to distrust and disobey their government. This was a formula that was largely followed by all the black radio stations Delmer set up. GSI, the first of these, had only two voices, the announcer who introduced the program and the chief, as he was called, played by the German refugee journalist Peter Secklmann. Secklmann had arrived, could I have a slide please, Monica? Secklmann had arrived in Britain in 1937, establishing himself as a freelance press and literary agent in London before volunteering for the Pioneer Corps after the outbreak of war. Delmer first met Secklmann in April 1941 and thought his voice just right for the chief. I quote, virile and resonant with just that slight trace of a German drawl, which I found so often in the speech of Junker officers of the Kaiser's Guards regiments. GSI began broadcasting the following month, in May 1941, just in time to capitalize on the surprising arrival in Scotland of Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess, carrying with him a peace proposal for the British government. Posing as a Prussian officer of the old school, Secklmann, as the chief, declared his violent hatred of the British, and even more so of the Russians, but then condemned the behavior of many Nazi officials and Wehrmacht officers whose conduct he portrayed as self-seeking, corrupt, and sexually depraved. He went on to attack Hess as the epitome of the gutless, what he called parlor Bolsheviks, who purported to be the party leaders. According to the chief, Hitler, who in his mind, of course, was the object of unconditional loyalty, had known nothing of Hess's Scottish plan. During the first broadcast, the chief was quick to confirm his anti-British stance by denouncing, and I quote, that flat-footed bastard of a drunken old Jew, Churchill, forgive me for that, one example of the extreme language used throughout the broadcast. Delmer's radical ideas on propaganda were not widely shared among the British intelligence community, let alone inside government. They were, for one, very different in style and ethos to the existing German language broadcast of SOE under Richard Kosman, which still set out to appeal to what he thought of as the good Germans. GSI, by contrast, was often vulgar, abusive, and even, according to Delmer himself, pornographic. One account by Secklmann as the chief, in which a German admiral was portrayed as conducting a sexual orgy, provoked a shocked reaction from Sir Stafford Cripps, a member of Churchill's war cabinet, who wrote to the Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden that, I quote, if this is the sort of thing that is needed to win the war, why, I'd rather lose it. GSI was broadcast at the same time on every day of the week to encourage regular listening, though there were inevitably problems of reception and of jamming by the Nazi authorities, particularly in Berlin and Leipzig. As with all propaganda broadcasting, it was difficult to assess exactly how the program was being received inside Germany. But PWE appears to have assembled sufficient evidence from scattered sources that GSI was both widely heard and widely believed to be a station operating inside Germany or German-occupied Europe. Much of the success of the program rested on Secklmann's authoritative performances, though he was soon joined by an aide de camp, played first by Johannes Reinhold, a member of the right-wing opposition to Hitler, and later by Frank Linder, actually his name was Leuwe, a young coffee broker from Bremen who'd arrived in Britain in January 1938. Over the next 2 years, Delmer assembled an impressive broadcasting team, including 2 assistants with prior experience of broadcasting, Ernst Adam and Alexander Maas. Adam, who had not arrived in Britain until 1941, had led a most variegated life. After military service in the First World War, he had become a school teacher and had then been imprisoned by the Nazis as a known communist, had fled to France, and from there to participation in the Spanish Civil War, serving in the International Brigade. It was in Spain, having risen to the rank of colonel, that he first met Delmer. Back in France, Adam joined the Deutsche Freiheitssender, broadcasting from Paris in the early months of the war. There then followed a period spent in a French internment camp, and finally, with Delmer's assistance, escaped to Britain via Spain and Portugal. Alexander Maas had gained his broadcasting experience first in Cologne, then in Moscow, then Madrid, and finally in Paris with the Deutsche Freiheitssender. He arrived in Britain, again due to Delmer's intervention, via Bermuda, having followed an even more circuitous route than Adam. Shortly after the launch of GSI, the second of Delmer's black stations began broadcasting, named Christ the King. Aimed at German Catholics, is presented by Father Andreas, in fact a young Austrian priest, Elmer Eisenberger. The program aimed to strengthen Catholic opposition to the Nazi regime by emphasizing the antithesis between Catholic doctrine and National Socialist practice. In complete contrast, Delmer also launched a German workers' station. Its cast including the actress Margit Maas, wife of Alexander Maas, who became known as Red Johanna. The station, which addressed its listeners as comrades, took the political line that German workers must seize power, put an end to the war between 2 capitalist countries and make peace. Then, early in 1943, Delmer launched yet another station, the Kurzwellensender Atlantic, that targeted the morale of the German U-boat crews attacking British and American convoys in the North Atlantic. This station was on the air without intermission from 6:30 in the evening till 8 o'clock the following morning, offering continuous jazz and dance music interspersed with news flashes and bulletins. The success of Atlantic in reaching its audience was borne out by the fact that at times the official German press agency was obliged to refute various news items broadcast by the station. The extended broadcasting hours meant that Delmer was obliged to take on new staff. One of the most versatile and unusual of whom was René Halkett. We have a slide of him. He was born Albert Georg Friedrich von Fritsch. He was the offspring of an aristocratic Prussian military family. Confounding the expectations of his family, he made a living as an artist, an actor, and a writer, adopting the name of Halkett from one of his Scottish ancestors. A convinced anti-Nazi, Halkett left Germany in 1936, the same year as his uncle Werner von Fritsch became commander-in-chief of the German army. Delmer recruited Halkett to his staff in 1941, and he subsequently worked as writer and announcer and even as singer for the Atlantic Sender and its successor, Soldatensender Carré. Now, there are, of course, numerous other enemy aliens who deserve a mention here. And in fact, there are 2 entire categories of refugee propagandists who appear in our book, but who have been omitted from this talk. Firstly, there are the many employed by the BBC in white broadcasting to the enemy. And secondly, those involved in the re-education of German and Austrian prisoners of war. These are both big subjects that would each merit a talk of their own. May I say, though, if you found this talk interesting, and are perhaps struck, as we were, by the fact that many of our protagonists and their contributions to the British war effort are virtually unknown today, we would urge you, if I may, to read our recent book. We have a slide, not terribly readable, but Working for the War Effort, the Contribution of German-Speaking Refugees to British Propaganda in the Second World War. Valentine Mitchell 2021, and to the end of this year, there's a 20% discount. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much indeed, Charmian. As fully expected, that was totally fascinating, and I could have listened for much longer, but the night is drawing on, I'm aware, and I think now is the moment for anybody who has questions to either raise their hands virtually or to type them into the chat. There must be some, I'm sure. Where to start? I mean, it goes off in so many extraordinary, sorry, start my video. There we are. Apologies. I should know by now, shouldn't I? So many different directions in which the conversation could be pursued. I mean, I suppose the very obvious question in terms of the timeliness or the fact that your book is only appearing now, why do you think it's taken so long for interest in this really important topic to come to the fore?
Well, I think it's partly that files in the public record, in the National Archives rather, have only fairly recently been released. I mean, that's true of the MI5 files, which only began to be released in 1999, and not all at once, of course, but a few at a time. And there are other files. I mean, now and then I did say in the talk in the recently released document, I think that's one of the reasons. And partly because I don't think it really occurred to anybody other than Division Me that there were so many German refugees involved in British propaganda. Mm. It was not known, and it was not ever spoken about.
As you said, it rather kind of subverts the myth, doesn't it, of yes, England standing alone. I'm struck with a very interesting recent book, which some of you may have come across. It's not about the Jewish contribution only. In fact, Charmian, I wonder if you do know about it. It's called by Wendy Webster, called Mixing It, which is actually, again, it's actually a fascinating book which talks about all the other people from all manner of different and diverse backgrounds, Jewish, Black, you name it, sort of thing, who played a very, very significant part in the British war effort, which, is part of, I suppose, that wider picture that we're trying to open up here. Yes, there's somebody, right, we've got some hands up. Whoever that is, sorry, the name doesn't give much away. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Hello, I think I've unmuted myself.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, and I'm Monica again, and I feel very uneasy about classifying Portugal as a neutral country during the Second World War. In fact, Portugal was a fascist dictatorship at the time, and it did somewhat underhandedly contribute to the Nazi war effort. And I think perhaps the clinching argument is that not many refugees who passed through Spain and Portugal remained in Portugal. In fact, they escaped to the United States as fast as their legs could carry them.
Yes, that's actually, sorry, yes, I mean, that's a very valid observation, but it doesn't quite tie in with the subject today. It's something we will be talking about in mid-December when we look at the heroic efforts of a Portuguese diplomat to save people fleeing from Nazi-occupied Europe. But thank you for your intervention. Right. Fine. Is it Yona? To what do you attribute the apparent lack of interest in post-war assessment of the efficacy of British propaganda on the continent?
Monica, could you repeat that?
Yes, slightly, yes. To what do you attribute the apparent lack of interest in the post-war assessment of the efficacy of British propaganda on the continent? So the kind of post-war assessment of how it worked, whether it worked, to what extent it worked.
All right, well, if we talk about Germany to start with, and perhaps Austria, I think in my experience, the Germans and Austrians have always been sort of reluctant to take on board the workers of refugees. There are, of course, many exceptions from this, but in general, it's scarcely spoken about. After the war, of course, there was definitely the feeling when refugees returned, we stayed here and had to go all this, and you went off and everything was fine, which of course is completely wrong. But I think probably because there was a great deal of interest in Germany, there perhaps wasn't a great deal of interest elsewhere, in France perhaps.
Big important question, isn't it? Okay, I think a good extra observation here, about the silence on the part of the main protagonists. Yes, why didn't people who were involved speak about what they had done after the war? Were they actually, I mean, they were sworn to secrecy, presumably, for certainly the black propaganda and possibly beyond that?
They were sworn to secrecy. But in addition to that, we know that someone like Carl Otten, for example, who was a writer and very involved in the early years with propaganda, sort of propaganda, he chose not to go back to Germany, even though he wanted to publish in Germany, he needed German publishing houses, but he chose to go to Switzerland, where he could also publish in German, where it was felt it wouldn't be held against him that he fought against his own country. And I think that was not an uncommon feeling.
There's somebody here who you may or may not know, Charmian, somebody called Gina Watson.
No, I don't think I know.
Oh, right, okay. Fine. I don't think actually, yes, you probably can see this, but yes, after being interned in Canada, my father, Peter Weichmann, nee Weichmann, a German refugee, worked on the later radio stations at Apsley Guys in Bedfordshire with Sefton Delmer from 1942 when he was only 20 until 1945. So Gina, perhaps I should put you in touch with Charmian. I think you'll have things to talk about.
Yeah, that would be very interesting.
Yes, so Gina, please do write either to Jewish Renaissance or indeed to the Insiders Outsiders email address on the Insiders Outsiders website, and I'll be very happy to forward your email to Charmian.
Thank you.
I would very much like to do that. I've
hello.
got quite a few of his papers, so yes.
That sounds great, yes.
Really interesting. Isn't it extraordinary? I mean, at every talk, you know, somebody comes forward, more material.
Yes,
yes. There is still much, much to be discovered. Indeed. I'm just scrolling through. Okay. I wondered, while other people are deciding whether to come forward, this question of roping in POWs, am I right, or have I got that slightly skewed? Obviously you wanted to sort of re-educate POWs, but am I right in thinking that actually in some cases POWs were actually roped in for propaganda purposes?
Yes.
Yes, that must have been problematic, to say the least.
I would think very problematic.
Yes.
They first seemed to appear in the BBC. They took part in BBC broadcasting, but one does come across them elsewhere as well.
Which is rather extraordinary. You know, if the British government and establishment had problems with, you know, sort of being convinced that the Jewish refugees were trustworthy. I mean, yes, it kind of, okay.
Well,
it's very, very, very extraordinary. And that takes me to this other question that you've rather, both you and Tony have touched on, but perhaps rather skirted around, the kind of, shall we say, endemic or really quite, you know, sort of deep-seated anti-Semitism and or anti-Germanism within the ranks of those in authority in Britain. Would you like to perhaps elaborate on that a bit more? It's obviously hard to prove, but you know, how much evidence is there of that?
Well, I think there's quite a lot of evidence, mostly from the throwaway remarks that you find in Home Office files, Foreign Office files, and so on. I mean, including the one that I quoted, where the Zeitung editors were advised not to have too many Jewish editors. And of course, you can understand in a sense that if they were to have any influence in Germany, you know, perhaps that wasn't such a good idea. But there was definitely anti-Semitism at the bottom of that remark. And you find that a lot. And with Peter Smolka, who I've mentioned, he was working in the Anglo-Soviet Liaison Center and rose quite high. And in his files, there are numerous remarks about why is this Austrian Jew in this position, and so on.
It's complicated.
It's complicated by the fact he turned out to be a Soviet agent, so it's quite difficult to know where one stands with Peter Smolka.
I mean, there's a whole other story there, isn't there? Of the
there is indeed, yes.
We'll leave that one aside for today. A comment here from Sue. Sorry, I can't offhand see the surname, but again, a family story. My grandmother worked. Sue, would you like to make yourself visible, or perhaps somebody in the background can unmute you and tell us yourself? Is it Sue Pavlovich? In the meantime, actually, just another question from me, Charmian. Is there any evidence of anyone ever who was making such important use of these refugees, apologizing for the internment episode?
No.
No, I mean, that's also quite extraordinary, isn't it?
No, it's never been apologized for.
No. Remarkable. Okay, Sue's telling me she has no microphone, so let me read out what she's written. She said, "My grandmother worked for Sefton Delmer at Woburn Abbey. She wasn't allowed to use public transport because her German accent might arouse suspicion. She had a chauffeur-driven car for occasional use, such as to attend my mother's wedding." Amazing. So again, if you'd like to be in touch, then please do.
That sounds very interesting.
How are we doing for time? Probably time to start drawing things to a close. Sue, sorry, you've unmuted yourself. Would you like to say anything further?
We did unmute Sue actually, but she doesn't have a microphone, so I think I see. Hear her.
Fine. Somebody, is it Richard? Comment about Selma. Hold on, that's not the right name. Is it about Sefton Delmer?
Sorry, Sefton Delmer. Yes, sorry.
Yes. Stop me in my tracks. Do go ahead.
Yeah.
Richard, would
very
you like
interesting.
to hold your camera so we can see you?
Sorry,
you can just see the top of your head.
There we go.
Yeah, there we are. The light's not very good. Little bit better. Very interesting talk, Charmian, and certainly get hold of your book. One of my favourite books is one called Black Boomerang, that is Sefton Delmer's account of his radio station. And I'm sure if people like your book, that they would try and get hold of a copy, because it's been out of print for many years now, and it's sometimes quite difficult to get hold of. That gives a more detailed account of his black propaganda radio station, which many German soldiers, although they were told it was a propaganda thing coming from England, they didn't believe it because it was so believable. Right up until the end. And I believe they helped do the diversion for the D-Day landings as well. They had a part in that. So, but it's a very good book, Black Boomerang.
Yes, I know the book. Yeah.
How reliable is it, though? I wonder. Just because it's written by somebody who's in the thick of it doesn't mean, necessarily mean that it's historically accurate. One has to.
Well, I heard about the book. I think it was Iris Murdoch was being interviewed. About 20 years ago on the radio, and she mentioned the book because I think she was somehow involved in the setting up of the radio station. I don't know if she was a German speaker, but obviously she was a writer, and maybe contributed to some of the scripts.
Pomerantsev, whose talk I'm afraid wasn't recorded, but who talked. It was the opening talk of this series, alluded to her, and I promptly found the book in question. I'm just trying to remember the title. It's something about East River. Is it called The House on the East River? It's only it's almost like a novella. It's a very almost surreal, quite perturbing book, but clearly, yes, she was involved, and indeed Peter Pomerantsev, I think, is
yes.
So interesting. Okay. Another question, sorry, if I may, from Sue, apropos her grandmother. I've tried to trace her name and further details about her. Are there any records I could consult? I mean, are we still thwarted? Are you still thwarted in finding out more by the inaccessibility of, or indeed the destruction, perhaps, of many of the records?
Many of the records have been destroyed, but you can only start at the National Archives and see what they've got there. Sometimes it is possible to ask for files to be released, personal files to be released that haven't been released up till now. And it does take a while, but it is quite possible to do that, especially if you're a relation, a descendant.
And I should just add to that Peter Pomerantsev is working on a book precisely on this subject, and I think he's pretty good at detective work, so it'll be very interesting to see what he comes up with. I think the book won't be out for a while, but look out for it. So it's nearly 9:15, so I think it's probably time to draw things to an end. If I can just, all right, I will thank Charmian very much indeed, and indeed also Tony Grenville for his introduction there, but also just conclude by saying that while our previous two talks were very much about military operations of an extraordinary nature. There will be another talk which focuses on a remarkable individual who's a particular interest of mine, namely Elizabeth Friedlander, a very talented graphic designer and typographer, but who's also, unbeknownst to most people, very active in black propaganda for the British war effort. And that's going to be on the 9th of December. So do look out for that and hope to see you there. I should also mention something I should have actually done at the very beginning, that Charmian contributed a wonderful essay to the Insiders Outsiders anthology that was published in March 2019 to coincide with the Insiders Outsiders Festival, focusing specifically on the visual artists who worked for the British war effort. So if that's your particular interest, I would urge you to check out the book. It's still very much available, published by Lund Humphreys. And Emma, have we given the details of the discount on the new book, the current book that's been the subject of today's talk? Again, you remember that you can benefit from that discount. Lovely. So let me hand over to Aviva to say the last few words. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Charmian.
Thank you so much to both of you, particularly a huge thank you to Charmian for that erudite and knowledgeable talk. And so beautifully illustrated as well. So thank you for all the preparation that went into it. We're very grateful. And I do hope that our audience will now go on and buy Charmian's book, which is called Working for the War Effort. Just when I'm doing books, by the way, Monica, I think what was being referred to was actually the Muriel Spark rather than Iris Murdoch novel.
Absolutely
House
right.
by the East River.
Absolutely. Apologies.
So,
yeah.
And if people want to read that, I also went and looked it up. It's a really quirky, interesting, quite unsettling little novel.
It's a very unsettling book, and you're right, of course, it's Muriel Spark.
Muriel Spark, who is much sharper than Iris Murdoch, but Iris Murdoch was obviously kind of very warm and thoughtful and quite metaphysical, actually, in her approach to some of these questions. But we're going from the sublime, really, of the kind of metaphysical, or even of Muriel Spark's humour or Charmian's talk, to the ridiculous next week. So just to finish off by advertising that next week we're actually going from books to film. We're starting a little series of 4 sessions that are going to be about films, or in this case a film, a musical and a book. So in January, a film is about to be released with Colin Firth playing Ewan Montague in Operation Mincemeat, which is a slightly ridiculous and quirky take on one of the covert operations that occurred. And Ewan Montague's granddaughter, I think it is Rachel, and possibly other members of the family are hoping to join us to talk about that. Originally, there was a book written by Ben McIntyre that came out about 10 years ago, who did a lot of research. And actually, there have been other films, including documentaries about Ewan Montague's life. But we're now in the centre of a huge fictionalisation of his life and those covert operations, because as well as the film which is coming out, there's recently been a musical. So some of you might have seen it at the Southwark Playhouse. It's coming back in January, and we actually have a guest who was very involved in that musical, Natasha, who both helped create it and performed in it. And she's going to be joining us alongside the members of the Montague family. So we'll have Rachel to talk about the real history of her grandfather, Ewan Montague, and his involvement in Operation Mincemeat, and Natasha to talk about fictionalising it, dramatising it, and producing it in the West End. So I hope you'll join us for that. It promises to be a really fun session. Thank you again very much to Charmian and to Monica. And also I just want to say a last thank you to Lions Learning Project. It's the Lions Learning Project who have been funding and supporting this series, curating and programming it alongside Monica. And actually next week is going to be chaired by the Lions Learning producer and Jewish Renaissance producer, Emma Brand. So we'll look forward to seeing her alongside our speakers. Thank you again and have a good evening.